to this edition of Pandemic Parenting for this week. And we're excited you're here. There's, with all our kids being home, or your kids being home, mine are already out of the house, but tremendous opportunity to parent them well and to change some of the habits we do. Maybe developed that have been good or bad, and I guess if they're bad ones, then we want to change them.
Mm-hmm.
It's good ones, and today we're going to talk about. Well, Noah's going to introduce it.
So the topic of the week is going to be discipline. As Jack mentioned, we're home. The kids are home still, and so this issue of discipline kind of comes right in line with the conflict that we talked about last week. As conflict happens, and we help them think through how to work through that, and we try to work through that ourselves. This issue of discipline and talking through and walking through this process happens in our house often during the day, and it's not something that is the end of the world. It's not something that you should try to avoid at all costs. I would say on the other side of it is it gives you an opportunity to walk through the gospel as we're going to talk about here.
Yeah, and that is the key of all of this. With discipline processes is a great opportunity to share the gospel, to be training our children up in the gospel so that they understand it and the pieces of it. So the first piece of that is helping them to understand what it was that they did wrong, whether they stole Johnny's toy or beat their brother up or the conflict or whatever it was. We want to move them outside of the group or outside of the, into the bathroom or the bedroom or wherever it might be, and help them, sit them down, help them to understand what it was that they did wrong. And I had boys, as we talked about last week, and I would say, did you know what you did wrong? And he said, no. So sometimes we'd have to help pull them out of it and ask good questions. And then after that, too, and you begin to think about that sin and focus on the heart rather than necessarily the particulars of what they did wrong. And so questions like, well, why did you take that toy? What were you wanting so bad that you were willing to grab that toy out of your brother's hand? And so help them to understand their heart in the midst of it. And then you're coming alongside of them and say, well, I have that same selfish heart as well. And so, which then leads you then to the next piece.
The next piece. And so as you then have dealt with the sin and you've talked about the issue that's there, that leads you to forgiveness. That leads you to the point where you talk about and you're able to bring it to the cross. Ultimately, you're able to say, we both have this selfish heart, we both have this pride, we both have this, whatever. But in this instance, you sinned, and I would say you need to first help the kids realize and remind yourself through it that this sin is first and foremost against God. It's first and foremost missing the mark of what God has told us we should be doing and what's right and what pleases Him. And so as we miss the mark, that impacts our relationship with God. And so depending on where your children are, your children may have a relationship with God and they may understand that piece of it, and they may be on the younger side and not have that piece of it. So that gives you an opportunity, again, to not just share the gospel, but to encourage them to consider what a relationship with God has involved in it and how that might be a little bit different. And so if your child has a relationship with Christ and has, asked Him for the forgiveness of their sins, place their faith and trust in Him, then you have an opportunity to have them, again, take time and pray and ask God for forgiveness, for sort of that 1 John 1:9 model that we see there. And so we have that opportunity there. If they're not saved, then they don't have that relationship with Christ, then you certainly have the opportunity, again, to talk to them about it. But then they need to deal with the forgiveness of others. And so once they've dealt with the relationship with God, again, because sin is first and foremost against God, then they are able to deal with the forgiveness from others. And you want to help them think through that in the sin piece, as well as then moving into the forgiveness piece, because this sin has put something in the way of their relationship with God, and you've dealt with that then, and then you have to deal with what's in the way in their relationship with others, and you can't ignore it. And I'll be 100% honest, it's easier to ignore it. As you walk through this process, it's time consuming, it's hard, especially depending on the child, and sometimes what makes it hard is that you're doing it 3 times in an hour, and that's overwhelming for the kids sometimes as well as for you. But to be consistent and to walk through this and have the same process every time and to help them think through, okay, what you did was wrong. It was wrong to God. Yes, this is where God says in His Word that we ought not be doing this. But then also, you have to move to seek forgiveness of others. And we talked about that briefly last week. I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? Those are different words for different purposes. I'm sorry is an accident. You can use that and that suffices there. But when you've sinned against there, when there's sin, we need to make sure that we are seeking the forgiveness of those that we sinned against.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this process takes a little longer than just sending the kid to the corner or the room or, giving them a spank or whatever you might do in your home. And Scripture actually has some things to say about that. We don't have time today to address that at all, but certainly worthy of maybe another conversation for pandemic parenting. But once that forgiveness process is completed and the child has finished through with that or followed through with that, then there's the restoration piece where the child is fully restored, because in their sin, they've created a conflict, they've created a barrier between themselves and somebody else in the family, and so they've removed themselves to some degree from fellowship in the family. And so part of the process here is to restore them back into full fellowship in the family, make sure that they are restored with one another and they're back together again. And then the last piece of the gospel is to rejoice. We rejoice in God's amazing forgiveness and what He has done for us. And so we make sure that we have that opportunity. And that's part of the restoration process as well. And so, it works out well, because it's teaching your child day by day the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is the most important thing that they need for their lives. And so when they grow up understanding it then and seeing it lived out daily, not just between them and their siblings, but also between mom and dad and dad and them. And, because we sin sometimes too, and we need to seek their forgiveness, when we become angry or whatever it might be. And so they see that. And so that it's lived out before them, and then that makes it attractive to them to accept Christ on the end of that. A couple of resources for us. These are both Tripp books, one by Paul Tripp and one by Ted Tripp. So these are older books, but both of these books were instrumental in my parenting. So helpful as Sue and I were trying to figure out what we were supposed to do after we came to Christ, and then after we started having kids. It's like, what does this look like? Because I didn't grow up with this, so it's totally new. So this book, Age for Opportunity, this is a book for older kids, teenagers. And discipline there looks a little different than it does when your kids are little. Certainly the gospel's front and center in it every time, but it becomes a little bit more conversational when they get older. And so he does a great job of helping you through that and helping you to think through questions to ask your young adult or older, younger teen, to help them to understand how the gospel fits in and to work them through not just the discipline and what they did wrong, but also the heart issues behind that as to why they do what they do. So tremendous book, Age of Opportunity by Paul Tripp.
Yeah, another resource by Ted Tripp is called Shepherding a Child's Heart. And this one, again, as Jack mentioned, is focused at younger children, and this really does a good job, I think, of framing your role as a parent, and not just then big picture, which Age of Opportunity does as well to some extent, but it frames your role as a parent so that way you understand the tasks that God has given you from a biblical perspective, and then it walks you through some of the different pieces that you have to deal with as a parent and that you have to understand. And again, one of those pieces being discipline and helping you think through. This is the heart is the issue that we got to get to. Yeah. That's what we got to get to. It reminds me with Olivia, our oldest, right now, she likes the phrase that I can't be perfect. She loves to say that. Nobody can be perfect, Dad. So even when I mess up, I can't be perfect. And that just is a good reminder to me that there are opportunities every day, whether it's a statement like that or a joke of some kind, that though you can let it go, you also have an opportunity to say, and I find myself saying often with Olivia, that no, you're not going to be perfect. But when we sin, we need to take it seriously. And that's really what discipline in this process is about, because Christ took it seriously. So seriously that it nailed him to the cross. And we can't make light of that. And so we need to be careful and make sure that we don't just dismiss sin as a common everyday thing that's okay. And we also don't want to end up on the other ditch where it's the end of the world. So you got to find that happy medium of being able to walk through this process of the gospel in discipline. And I would say that becomes a really good middle ground for us. And so, those are some resources. I'll put the links down below for Amazon. They're also available here in the Resource Center. Also, if you have questions for us to deal with during this time and pandemic parenting episode for next week, please comment below, shoot us an email, give us a call, let us know. We'd love to field some of your questions. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have a great day. Bye.